Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to the Barts 900 series of webinars. This is the second in the series that we started last month when we welcomed Professor Charles Knight as our guest. And I can assure you that we have a guest of equal standing here for the second in the series. Once again, we've got a big international audience. We've got listeners right across both coasts of the North American continent. Nobody in Australia this time. I think it's 2 o'clock in the morning there. So no doubt they'll be catching up on our Barts Heritage YouTube channel, where I'll be telling you where you can review this recording later in the program. Substantially increased numbers. We've got a 50% increase in our audience tonight. So we really are gathering momentum, I feel sure, as interest gathers pace in what we're trying to do here at Barts Heritage. Now, don't forget that during the program, you can post questions to our guest speaker by using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And we very much look forward to as many of those questions as possible. And obviously, we will try and answer those during the program, as well as cover all the topics that we've got lined up for Will to talk about. So, Will Palin, he was appointed Chief Executive of Barts Heritage. Goodness me, it's only a year ago, but hasn't a great deal happened during that short space of time as we begin to gather pace with the whole momentum of what we're trying to achieve with the restoration of the North Wing complex here at Barts. Now, Bill, Will, I suppose we ought to start off with a little bit about yourself and your career pathway. Because, of course, when you first went up to Oxford for the first time, I think you read English on that occasion. And tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to this really very specialist career.
Thanks, Robert. The first thing I should say is that my mother always wanted me to be a doctor, but I was hopeless at science. So I ended up studying English for my degree. I then had a brief spell as a sub-editor in a national newspaper that was interesting, but I decided by that point that I needed to do something slightly different. So I went back to school. I did a master's at the Courtauld in architectural history, and that was really when a particular path began to open up for me. And there are architects in my family as well, so I was encouraged to pursue a career in architecture, but similarly to medicine, I was hopeless at science and maths, so I couldn't become an architect. So there wasn't really much left other than becoming somebody who sort of studied buildings or an architectural historian, as they're sometimes called. So I had a series of very lucky breaks. My father always says I'm very jammy. And my first break was to get a job working at Sir John Soane's Museum in London, which is an incredible place. Wonderful architectural collection, and also one of those early encounters which sort of mark out my career path to Barts, this sense of strange foreboding that I'm going to end up in EC1, because as many of you will know, there are two wonderful series of Hogarth paintings at the Soane Museum, A Rake's Progress and An Election. And I decided while I was at the Soane to become a Hogarth expert, or as much as I could during that time. And I used to give tours of the museum like we all did as curators. And I used to so enjoy showing the Hogarth to visitors because the Soane Museum is a strange place. It's rather sepulchral. There's lots of mummies and death masks and sarcophagi. And it was nice to have Hogarth there because he was a bit of a companion, and we had a lot of laughs together. And I thought I would just share my first slide, if it works. Oops. Sorry, bear with me. Yes, and some of you will be familiar with this scene. It's from A Rake's Progress. Now, Hogarth was interesting because unlike the Victorians, who regarded as all the vices and corruption in society as coming up from the bottom up, percolating up through society, Hogarth firmly believed that the rot started at the top and vice trickled down from the aristocracy through to the middle classes and so on. And the Rake's Progress is one of his famous modern moral subjects. It's the protagonist is a sort of middle class boy who inherits a fortune from his miserly father and begins to ape the manners of a gentleman. And it all ends very badly for him. But this scene is the orgy scene, which is set in a notorious tavern in Covent Garden called the Rose Tavern. And you can see there's Tom Rakewell having a good time. And I'm only showing you this because I remember having to go through talk about the paintings to school groups, and I also didn't know quite how much detail to go into when I got to the orgy scene. And I was with one group of, I think they were schoolgirls from a London school, and I got to this scene and I was sort of looking slightly nervous, and the teacher leaned over to me and whispered in my ear, tell them they're playing musical chairs. So that has stayed with me, as has Hogarth. From the Soane, I sort of moved into architectural heritage and campaigning proper, really. I became director of an organisation called Save Britain's Heritage. And there was another interesting sort of overlap there. I mean, not only was I working in Clerkenwell, but one of our big cases was to try and prevent the demolition of Smithfield General Market. This was in the first decade of this century. And we won 2 public inquiries. And of course, that's all ended rather brilliantly with the Museum of London taking the buildings as their new home. So that's a wonderful sort of outcome of that particular battle. And then, of course, I went to Greenwich, the Old Royal Naval College, to take on a new role of conservation director. And the great thing about new roles is that no one has a clue what they really mean. So you can do pretty much what you like up to a point. I got stuck in at Greenwich. I was responsible for one of the most wonderful groups of Baroque buildings in the country. And of course, the Painted Hall project, which emerged during my time there.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that, because that was the last major project that you'd completed before coming to Barts. It was an £8 million project to restore the Painted Hall at the Old Royal Naval College. And I know a number of our viewers will have been to see it both before and after the restoration. Give us some sense of the size of that project and what you managed to achieve.
Sure. I thought I would start off with some drone footage, if it works. Now, one of the most wonderful things about Greenwich, and indeed English Baroque architecture, or indeed any great architectural site, is that they have this fluidity, dynamism and drama, which is best appreciated when you walk in and around them. And so looking at a static view of Greenwich doesn't really convey that sense of spectacle. And I think this little bit of drone footage helps to people to understand just what a complex and exciting group of buildings these are. Of course, designed by Christopher Wren, built as the Royal Hospital for Seamen, the foundation stone laid in the 1690s. So the sort of generation before Barts was built. The building here on your right of your screen with the one with the dome, of course, the great twin domes over the chapel, and this one is the Painted Hall. And I will stop that and attempt to restart my slides. So there is the great sort of iconic view of Greenwich from the river, painted by Canaletto. We have the Queen's House in the distance, an earlier building by an architect called Inigo Jones. The Painted Hall on the right, the chapel on the left. And And here is a popular depiction of those naval pensioners. It was built as a hospital, one of the many sort of links really with Barts. But by hospital, it really meant a sort of place where men who had been broken at sea, had served for the British Navy, had been injured or infirm, were looked after at the expense of a grateful nation. And the popular depiction of the Greenwich pensioners were, you know, these jolly chaps at the local taverns having a beer, usually with a missing limb of some kind. So it's a bit like Bart's trustee meetings at the Bishop's Finger in Smithfield, but without the sort of lack of limbs and the naval gear. And of course, the centerpiece of the great project at Greenwich, and something that reveals that this was, although it was ostensibly a sort of care home for people who had served in the Navy, much more than that, it was an expression of the confidence, or the emerging confidence, of the nation as the preeminent naval power in the world, and also a nation that could compete for the first time culturally with other European powers. And so the architecture and the art at Greenwich is terribly important for projecting that message. And the Painted Hall is a ceremonial heart of Greenwich. It was built first. It was the first block to be completed, a bit like the North Wing at Barts, for the same reason. When they completed the structure, and the clerk of works was someone called Nicholas Hawksmoor, who worked for Wren and was interestingly also on the building committee at St Bartholomew's Hospital in the 1720s. But they finished it, and then they had to get it decorated. And the problem was that the only people really capable of doing this were European artists. But that was a problem, because the ceiling celebrated the triumph of peace and liberty over tyranny. And the theme at the centre, of course, is William III with Queen Mary, surrounded by the cardinal virtues, trampling on a figure of arbitrary power and tyranny, and this is Louis XIV of France. So the idea of having a Catholic painter working at Greenwich with this kind of theme wouldn't really have worked very well. Fortunately, a painter called James Thornhill emerged. He'd been working for some of the directors at Greenwich and other important projects, and he executed this vast scheme over a period of about 20 years. It's the greatest achievement in English history painting and Baroque art. And the important link, of course, with Barts is that James Thornhill's daughter, Jane, married William Hogarth, and Hogarth looked at Thornhill's achievement as something that he wanted to emulate in some way himself. Interestingly, the Painted Hall had many lives. This is one of them, as the gallery, National Gallery for Naval Art. The Thornhill paintings sort of just becoming secondary really to this gallery of naval subjects. And interesting, looking at this photograph of the Great Hall at Barts during the general strike. It's a famous photograph, 1926. But it also shows paintings hung low along the walls. Some of those you may recognise. I think that's Abernethy on the right-hand side, so somewhere here. These paintings now hang elsewhere in the complex, but the Great Hall would have been a sort of slightly different entity 100 years ago. Lots of art and busts and furniture, slightly more cosy and less grand in a way. And I couldn't resist showing you this slide because it features Johnny Depp, very topically, in the centre during the filming of Pirates of the Caribbean at Greenwich. Greenwich, a great filming location, very popular film location. We made about £500,000 in a good year from filming on the site. And we're hoping that we can also attract some blockbusters to Barts too, possibly over the years to supplement our income. Now, the Great Hall, the Painted Hall, suffered, like all great sort of works of art, from the ravages of time. And historically, the way you dealt with paintings that began to darken, or the varnish began to darken and deteriorate, was a quick fix. You slap more varnish on. And here we have, before the days of health and safety, a restorer in the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, also decorated by Thornhill, slapping on some varnish to sort of bring the paintings back up to standard for a while. But of course, what happened was the varnish would then deteriorate and darken, and you'd have to slap some more on. And over the years, there were at least 15 campaigns of restoration in the Painted Hall, which left 15 layers of varnish on the paintings, which were mostly removed in the 1950s. Interestingly, when we carried out our conservation project, we found the signature of one of the restorers from 1797. He had chosen to sign his name on the bosom of Queen Mary, which wasn't very delicate of him, but there we are. And this is what we faced when we started our project. The paintings had blanched. It is really a chemical reaction caused by the hardening and cracking of the varnish that catches the light and creates this whitening of the surface. So we were faced with having to deal with about 40,000 square feet of decorative painting to develop a methodology and a technique for mobilizing the varnish. We couldn't really take it off, that would be too risky, and to get the painting singing again and the color and the vibrancy to be brought back. The project started in 2016. It was an £8.5 million project with a very generous grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. And it took about 2.5 years to complete. It involved a fairly small team of restorers there. This is Francesco doing some cleaning. Some of the other team working on the architectural elements, the sculptural elements of the Great Hall. Sorry, the painted.
I've got to ask, Will. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm sure that we've all seen art restorers going over paintings with that little bit of cotton wool wrapped around the stick and methylated spirits or whatever it is, the solvent in the other end. Do you seriously mean that they went over 40,000 square feet in precisely that manner to bring that ceiling back to its glory?
I'm afraid so, yes. I mean, it was an absolutely heroic task. And it has to be done in a very painstaking way. And obviously, the smaller the team, the easier it is to control the level of treatment. So what you don't want is to start at one side of the ceiling with one conservator and end up reaching the middle and find out that they've been doing a completely different level of cleaning to the other and they don't match. So a small team means that you can control that. It was more than sort of one project. In fact, it was really 4 separate projects, the Painted Hall conservation. There was the work to the paintings themselves, which you've talked about. There was a huge and complex mechanical and engineering project to improve the environmental conditions within the hall, which I won't go into, but it was very technical and very challenging. There was a complete capital works project in the undercross space below to make a new visitor centre. And we inconveniently discovered part of Henry VIII's Tudor palace under the floor, which we then had to put on display. So that added to the complexity. And then, of course, what we wanted to do, and with the encouragement of the lottery, was to actually get the public in to watch the process happening, rather than closing the door for 2.5 years, to allow the public to watch the work and to understand what was happening on site. Now, that sounds like a wonderfully kind of noble thing to do, but we decided to build this into the DNA of the project from the very start. And this involved designing everything around public access. So the scaffolding you can see in this image, which is a work of art in itself, had to give the conservators access to the walls and the ceiling, but also had to allow the public safe access to a huge deck below the ceiling where they could be taken round, they could be given tours by conservators and our amazing public engagement team. And a huge amount of credit goes to our public engagement team there and the director, Sarah Duthie. So it was complicated and slightly mad, and at many points I just thought this is not going to work. But somehow we managed to pull it off. and it was just had to be absolutely meticulously organised. So we trained our staff within an inch of their lives. We made sure there were people within the conservation team who had the skills to be able to communicate to both our internal team, but also to the public. And we had a special system of microphones and headsets, so people wouldn't be disturbed by the banging and crashing around. And this was the experience. You would go up sort of 15 meters up onto this deck, and it was very weird and wonderful. You had this sort of close encounter with Thornhill. You know, not how he should be looked at all, because everything had to make sense from below, where the perspective and the clever techniques he employed visually could be best appreciated. But here, you just got these kind of mad and wonderful close-ups of his work. And the guide here is pointing a torch at a figure representing Winter, one of the gods of the, or goddesses of the four seasons. It was actually a portrait of a naval pensioner called John Worley, who James Thornhill rather liked because he was always getting into trouble and being fined for drunkenness and other things. So he decided to immortalise him on the ceiling of the painted hall here, so the other pensioners could look up and see one of their own amongst the gods and the goddesses. And here is some of the conservation team. And I'm just showing you this photograph because the chap on the right-hand side of your screen, Stephen Payne, is going to be leading the conservation work at Barts. And he's already been in, he's done his preliminary report on the Hogarth and the Great Staircase. And it's wonderful to have, to be able to retain some of these people and bring them across. Because I think Barts deserves the very best and the best technical skills and the best conservators. That was the finished hall, reopened in March last year. All sorts of clever hidden lighting and things that we're very proud of, but I'm not going to go into that. And of course, there is the Great Hall at Barts, just to show you that you know, it may not be as large as Greenwich, but my goodness, it's an incredible space. And I think after finishing the Greenwich project, there's probably only one other place I could have gone, and here it is. And I'll just lastly say that the connections between Greenwich and Barts, I've mentioned Hawksmoor, the mason Edward Strong, who was Wren's master mason at St Paul's and who also worked at Greenwich. It was either he or his son, Edward Strong Jr., who designed the gatehouse at Barts facing West Smithfield, which is a slightly earlier building to the north wing. So there are all these links and connections between the two buildings, which made sort of coming here rather sort of perfect.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the way in which you approach the whole project management side of it. You mentioned that you're going to be bringing some of your specialists that you work with at Greenwich, and that's great news, and we've already met some of them. But there must be parallels in the way you approach a problem of this magnitude. I mean, we've got some pretty experienced people amongst the audience tonight. We've got some very highly trained and experienced nurses and doctors who are dealing with with complex problems of another nature. How do you even begin to approach a project of this size? What are the threads that you need to pull together to make it happen?
Well, I think, you know, what you need is a good team, and I always feel like a complete imposter. Really, I'm there, sort of, you know, running around, sort of conducting things, I suppose. But you need a very good architect. We had an excellent architect at Greenwich. We've got a great architectural team for Donald Insall on this project. So they oversee a lot of the coordination of the technical side of things. You need a very clear vision. You need to know exactly what you want to achieve, and you need to have a clear idea of where you're not going to compromise. And I think with a building of this quality, a grade 1 listed building, which has a very, very special atmosphere, it's a fragile entity. And if you're not careful, you don't think things through properly, you can end up damaging that special quality and lessening the atmosphere of the building itself. So there has to be a philosophical approach, there has to be an excellent team led by a good architect, and there has to be a high level of technical expertise. And that is what we are beginning to assemble for the Barts project.
Now, you've already mentioned James Gibbs, the architect who put together the three remaining wings of the hospital in the early 18th century. Tell us a little bit more about that history and what makes it so special as it relates to the project that we're anticipating.
It's a very, very interesting period, that first sort of 2 or 3 decades of the 18th century, particularly when we're looking at London or indeed other great cities across England, because there was a feeling that civic architecture and our great cities deserved to be better served by civic and public buildings, and there needed to be a sort of a step change in the way that we designed and presented our great cities, particularly in London, which had always slightly kind of fallen behind when compared to other European cities. So there was a sense of pursuing this august civic dream, and the Barts project was sort of conceived on that ground. There was obviously there'd been a hospital there for 600 years, and it had grown and it had become a sort of muddle of buildings. There was a medieval quads and courtyards. It sort of looked a bit like probably some of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. And so there was a desire amongst the hospital governors to tidy things up, make it regular, introduce some ordered classical architecture. And Gibbs was invited to join as a governor, which he did. He drew up the first sort of designs for how the new hospital should be ordered. And these were very interesting because the idea of creating a square or courtyard with 4 blocks that weren't joined together at the ends was innovative. And there's been a lot of recent excellent work done on this. There's an essay by Anne-Marie Akehurst in the Georgian Group Journal, which looks at the way that Gibbs was responding to hospital projects across Europe, this idea of separating wards to prevent contagion and fire. And that was his vision. And he, the project itself, a bit like Greenwich that took 50 years to complete, it began in the late 1720s, but the final block wasn't completed until 1769. And I think the other reason why he designed the blocks separately was he knew they would have to be independent of each other and could be built gradually over time.
Well, let's move on to one of the other great names associated with Barts, and that, of course, is William Hogarth. You've mentioned him already in connection with the Soane Museum, but Hogarth it was who painted the 2 great murals on what is now referred to as the Hogarth Stair. But he himself, he was born just over the road, wasn't he, in Bartholomew Close?
He was, and his mother and sister lived in the hospital, so his connections to this area were very deep. And of course, his father, who was sort of a failed school teacher, had various madcap projects, one of which was to open a coffee house at St John's Gateway in Clerkenwell. And the idea behind his coffee house was that people should speak only Latin when they came there, and remarkably it failed completely, and he ended up in debt.
Even in those days.
When Hogarth had the opportunity, he had become a bit like Gibbs, who had just completed 2 great London churches, St Martin in the Fields and St Mary le Strand. Hogarth was the height of his powers. He'd completed his 2 great progresses, the Rake's Progress and the Harlot's Progress. He was celebrated. He'd sold thousands and thousands of sets of the Princeton engravings and was making a lot of money. And he decided that he would have a go at history painting. He would try and emulate his father-in-law Thornhill, and he would show that an English artist could do this. And the governors had already eyed up a Venetian artist called Amiconi, who they wanted to give the project to, but Hogarth typically sort of elbowed his way to the front, said, no, I'll do it for nothing, give me the chance. So he won the commission to decorate the staircase in the north wing at Barts, which forms part of that wonderful processional route, you know, under the archway into the square, up the staircase into the great hall. He gave it a real go, and he talks quite amusingly about having sort of had the temerity to think he could sort of pull it off, and he genuinely did. But in doing so, he created a very original work of art, which is often misunderstood. Sorry, I just have a few quick slides showing the courtyard. Interestingly, before we go back to Hogarth, Gibbs had conceived the blocks to be faced in brick with stone dressings, but the governors wanted something more than that. So they decided to use Bath stone supplied by a very interesting entrepreneur called Ralph Allen, who had quarries in Bath. The buildings were originally faced in Bath stone rather than the Portland stone that you see today. It did not weather well. So within 100 years, the Bath stone had been completely replaced under the surveyorship of the Hardwicks. So that is what we have today in the gatehouse on the left. And then just going back to Hogarth for a minute, on the Henry VIII gatehouse, above Henry VIII, interestingly, you have two figures representing lameness and disease. This is a rather amazing thing when you think about it, that you have on the frontispiece, the entrance to a hospital, above Henry VIII, two figures representing the people who were treated in the hospital. And this is tradition in England, came from Bethlehem Hospital or Bedlam, where two figures on the pediment representing melancholy and raving madness were designed by the sculptor Caius Kibber, and those survive at the Bedlam Museum. You can see them today. And they also inspired Hogarth in the Rake's Progress, that the rake, Tom Rakewell, who we met earlier, ends up sort of gambling, losing his money, and eventually going mad and ending up in Bedlam. And there he is in the bottom right-hand corner, being visited by his faithful mistress. On the left-hand side, you can see the figure in the pool of Bethesda, the staircase at Barts. And this is the lame man trying to reach the pool. And again, there is an evocation, a link between all these figures that makes it terribly interesting from an art historical point of view. And just a couple of wonderful photographs of the Hogarth stair. In yesteryear, we have on the left one that many of you will know and have seen, which is a group of nurses posing on the stair in the 1920s. These rather wonderful lamp standards on the staircase, which I'm quite hoping we can bring back as part of our project. I love the photograph of the nurses because they've obviously just been sort of told to stand there and look. They don't look particularly interested, but it's an amazing scene. And of course, that is the Hogarth stair as we see it today, with the pool of Bethesda facing you as you walk up the stairs. That's on the east wall. And the second painting, the Good Samaritan, on the left-hand side. You know, I'm not going to talk for hours about the Hogarths at Barts, but they are an amazing achievement. I mean, if you judge them sort of purely in terms of their sort of artistic quality, and you compare them to other history paintings of the time, they don't really fit in. And a lot of architectural critics and art critics have found it quite hard to kind of get their heads around what Hogarth was doing. But his achievement is to create this very sustained view that helped people to understand and interpret what Barts was all about as a hospital. So the pool of Bethesda is the centre, the central figure, of course, is Christ, the intermediary between heaven, the angel above, and earth. And he is saying to, of course, the lame man, pick up thy bed and walk. And Hogarth has set up this typical composition with this opposition to weighing morality and society in the scale. So on the left-hand side behind Christ, you have the innocent afflicted, those people that have got various illnesses and conditions which are no fault of their own. And on the right-hand side, you have this lady who's being brought to the pool, and they're trying to get her in before anyone else, because of course there's only one chance once the angel has troubled the waters to get in there and get healed. And she is a lady of sort of some wealth, and her servant is preventing the lady with the baby from entering ahead of her. And she is someone who represents sort of the afflictions being brought upon oneself through the choices one makes in life. And then in the far right-hand side is this deathly figure, which I think is quite extraordinary, because you come face to face with this figure once you descend the staircase. And you can imagine the governess of the hospital walking down the staircase and staring at this the skeletal features of this figure, which represents basically death, because this man is not going to make it to the pool, and he is staring down towards the ground, to the abyss. And it's a chilling sort of reminder, and I've talked about this figure before, a reminder of one's mortality. And so that's one thing. Bethesda, we have the religious and the spiritual origins of the hospital. We have Christ, and we have the lame man being told to get up and walk. And I think there is a reference here. Elizabeth Einberg, the great Hogarth scholar, talked about this being a reference to England. Get up and walk. You can stand on your own 2 feet. It's a kind of sort of strange Brexit analogy. But I suppose Hogarth was doing something here in the same way. He was demonstrating that an English artist could stand on his own 2 feet and paint grand history paintings that would compete with those of the continental artists and the grand masters. And then, of course, the second painting, briefly, I suppose represents modern medicine. You've got the spiritual origins of the hospital in the Pool of Bethesda. Here you have the Israelite who's set upon by thieves and injured, and the priest walks by, the Levite priest walks by and doesn't help him, and the Samaritan, who the Israelites and the Samaritans hate each other, he's the one who comes to the man's aid and applies an ointment to his wounds, and you can see the way in which the wounded man is clenching his fist in a very visceral way as the ointment is applied. So I suppose this is modern medicine. This is what the hospital is all about. Healing the sick and the afflicted, and I think when you begin to look and understand what Hogarth is doing in these two paintings, you get a very different sense of his achievement.
Okay, well, we've covered quite a great deal of history, so let's move to the here and now, if we will. I know that you've had to rethink your ideas for the scheduling of the works to be done. Rather optimistically, in the initial stages, we thought that we might even have completed a major chunk by the time of the 900th anniversary of the hospital in 2023. But of course, that's completely up in the air because of the difficult situation in which we now find ourselves. Can you tell us a bit of an overview of your plan for how you see the schedule of works going ahead now? And in particular, of course, people will want to hear about how available the Great Hall might be in the immediate future for various meetings.
Well, we spent the first of year charging ahead with our project in terms of working with the design team, getting all the sort of technical aspects mapped out. So we're at what's called stage 3, RIBA stage 3 of the designs, which is quite advanced in terms of how we develop the the plans from the architectural point of view. Of course, we need to then raise quite a lot of money to take ourselves to the next stage, and then to begin to tee ourselves up for actually starting the repair work. Now, COVID has obviously affected that. And so what we've done is we've sort of split the project into two. We're talking about £23 million worth of work that needs to be done on these two buildings to bring them back into a good state, and because they haven't been terribly well looked after for the last 50 years or so. But obviously it's going to be difficult to raise £20 million in one go. So instead we split the project into doing the works to the fabric of the buildings, both buildings, the gatehouse and the north wing. Those are the two buildings which we have agreed the lease with the NHS Trust for. And then we will also tackle the Great Hall and the Hogarth Stairs, part of that first project. It's about £10 million worth of work, and the servicing around those. But the rest of the development of the North Wing will wait for phase 2. So in terms of our current timing, we are hoping to put in our lottery application as soon as we can, as soon as they reopen the fund, which I hope will be October this year. And we'll get moving on that. So we are looking now at, it's unlikely we're going to finish the project by 2023, which of course is the great 900th anniversary of Barts, but it will be in progress. And what I'm looking forward to is opening up the site that year so the public can come and see what's going on, see the conservation work and the restoration work in progress. And I think that's a wonderful way to celebrate the 900 years of the project. So that will complete 2024 probably, and then we'll be moving on to the next phase once I hope things and the fundraising climate is improved, and that will tackle all the other elements, complex elements of the project.
Well, thank you so much, Will. We run right out of time. We could have gone all evening. You touched on so many subjects that are very dear to all those who are connected with the hospital in various guises, both current and past members of staff, members of the wider community, all of whom have a keen interest in the history of this great place. And many of the subjects on which you touched, we will be covering in much greater detail in webinars to come, particularly William Hogarth. We're hoping that we're going to be able to get a specialist speaker on James Gibbs for our very next webinar at the end of August. We can't quite confirm that yet, but you will all get appropriate notice of that. So we look forward to seeing you again then. Now, the other good news I can bring you is, as you know, we had to make a small charge for tonight's presentation to cover our costs. But I'm pleased to announce that an anonymous donor has stepped forward to cover all the costs of these webinars for the future. And so all future webinars, as far as we know at this stage, we'll be able to offer you free of charge. So we're looking forward to even bigger audiences in the months to come, sticking hopefully with this pattern of the last Wednesday of each month. We'll circulate you as our present audience with that information. And do, of course, check out our website for updates on bartsheritage.org.uk, where we're putting a lot of additional information. Now, thank you for your questions. We've been able to touch on some of them, but no doubt there'll be others that we can bring into the specialist conversations later. We would certainly welcome your feedback on how you think tonight has gone. So do please reply to the invitation and we can pool all your feedback, which will help us in future productions, and also send us your ideas for other topics that you'd like to hear about other than the ones that I've mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, you can see a recording of this and the previous webinar on our dedicated Barts Heritage YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and put Barts Heritage in the search engine and it'll come straight up. So I think that's about all from me. I'd like to once again thank Will Palin for a fantastically entertaining evening. Thank you, Will. It's been absolutely fantastic, and we look forward to hearing more about how things go over the months and indeed years to come. I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and we hope very much to see you. Oh, Will, a final word, please.
Sorry, Rob, just a final word. I don't think my mother is tuned into this. I said at the beginning she wanted me to be a doctor and she's been very disappointed. But at least I can now say I work in a hospital. So if she is watching, maybe she'll be pleased to hear that.
If we've kept Mrs. Palin happy, we've achieved the target for our evening. Thanks very much, Will. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, a very good evening. Bye-bye.